Well, welcome all, particularly to our Unibo student. We encourage the University of Bologna students to come, so please spread the word. I'm also happy that there are people here who aren't in climate classes, because that's the point of SciSe, right? Is that you take certain classes, but this is your opportunity to engage in topics that maybe you don't have space for in your schedule. And most of all, I'm very delighted to have Jeff Colgan here to speak to us today. I think we couldn't have picked a better day to be talking about whether or not the Paris Agreement is changing corporate behavior or any behavior. It's the first day of COP. For those who are not following, the UNFCCC meets every single year for a big 2-week-long block of negotiations. There are interim negotiations or in between, but this is the 2 weeks of the year where we think climate and what is going to happen. And we now have the results of the US election in. We had John Podesta just coming out saying, you know, we're going to have to think differently about whether or not the US is going to be a champion, which is not surprising. This is our opportunity to have somebody who's been thinking a lot about climate politics, what kinds of problem they are, how do we get domestic action, international action, what is the relationship between the UNFCCC and actual policy change. So I'm really excited to have this talk today. I'm excited to learn a lot also about the corporate sector. A lot of people, at least in my Twitter sphere, said after the US election, all hope is not lost on climate action, even if Trump pulls us out of the UNFCCC like he tried to do last time, but actually the US never officially actually left. We can still look to cities, we can look to states, we can look to the corporations to take the leadership. I mean, these are the hopeful acts, so I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that. Let me briefly introduce Jeff before I hand over the floor to him. He's the Richard Holbrooke Professor in the Department of Political Science and Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs at Brown University, which Brown, by the way, just has a campus just down here. I don't know if you know about that. It's just down the road. They have a little team of researchers who come to Bologna.
I have to look into it.
I know.
Get in on that.
I know you will actually. Yeah, it's literally just like a couple of blocks away. He's the director of the Climate Solutions Lab at Brown University, and his research focuses on international order, security, especially related to energy and the environment. So very much also big IR themes, and those in my IR class, we were talking IOs, Bob Cohane's work, and I'm sure we can learn a lot from Jeff in this regards as well around IR theories. He has a triple award-winning book, Partial Hegemony, Oil Politics and International Order, which draws lessons from oil history about how states and other actors create and maintain international governance arrangements. So for those of you who are interested in energy politics, he has written an exceptionally rich amount and very, very high quality work on this. The book won the APSA Jervis Schroeder Best Book Award in International History and Politics, and the Best Book Award from APSA International Collaborations section, and Best Book in Energy Policy. He has previous work on a book called Petroaggression, When Oil Causes War, published with Cambridge University Press in 2013, and he has published numerous articles in international organization, foreign affairs, world politics, international security, and also occasionally blogs with foreign affairs and Monkey Cage on issues like climate politics. So definitely somebody to follow to both understand the academic debates as well as their implications for policy. So I think I will hand over to you now. You've got half an hour or 35 minutes to talk us through what the Paris Agreement means, and then really do think about your questions. I think try and give as much space for question and answer today. Also, to those of you who are here online joining us, welcome. Please do type your questions in the Q&A text box so that we can get through them. Awesome. You want to stand?
Yeah. Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming this evening to talk on a subject that is a very, very challenging one, especially after the US election that we've just had. But before I get into that, let me first say thank you to Nina for organizing this talk. I'm very grateful to be here. It's my first time to Bologna, and it is a lovely city. I've had a few hours to walk around and quite enjoyed it. But it's really a treat and an honor to be hosted by somebody whose scholarship that I really admire and have learned from. And so, and I've been lucky enough to have Nina come give a guest lecture in my classes at Brown. And so it's nice to be able to reciprocate in some way. I am going to talk a little bit about well, a lot about the Paris Agreement and the effect that it's had on corporate actors. But it would be strange, I think, to have this talk a week after the U.S. election and not reflect on that just for a moment, right? And so, you know, what does the election of Donald Trump as president mean for U.S. climate policy? I think you probably already know the gist of that answer, right? It's not good, and it is very likely to set U.S. leadership on this issue back a very long way. It makes the United States a less credible partner for countries around the world, and it takes sort of the message of, you know, that the whole world needs to work on this issue together. It makes it a whole lot less credible from U.S. diplomats, at least, and that's a big loss. As much as it is easy to carp about the U.S. leadership, and as a Canadian-born scholar, I find it all too easy to take pot shots at U.S. leadership. The truth is that its role in international diplomacy is like no other, and so it is a major loss to see the U.S. Turn away from climate change for at least 4 years, and who knows what the future comes. That does not mean that all hope is lost, and so what I think it does mean in the next little while is for people who care about climate politics to think seriously, at least within the United States, but maybe elsewhere as well. How to sort of pick ourselves up off the floor, dust ourselves off, and say, okay, what's the art of the possible over the next little while? And the truth is, that's not just an issue for the United States. I think every country is going to have moments where, in the long run of climate politics, which is a marathon, not a sprint, we're going to have stretches where it's uphill, where it is difficult, and we're not necessarily going to run as fast as we would like to. And so this is something that every country is going to wrestle with. My home country, Canada, is about to have an election next year where it is very likely that the Conservatives will come to power in a very significant way and do more or less the same thing, right? So every country wrestles with this. And so we need to think about climate politics on not just a national state-by-state level in a sort of traditional IR way, but as a, you know, multiscalar, transscalar kind of issue in a way that actually reflects a lot of the work that Nina, as I should say, Professor Hall has been doing for many years. And so one of the questions that we wanted to take seriously, and I say we because I'm working with two others, Fiona Barr, who's a PhD student at Princeton, and Alexander Gard-Murray, who was a postdoc at Brown University and continues to be an affiliate at my lab. The three of us wanted to investigate this question about, you know, look, political scientists like to think about state-to-state action. We like to think about governments as our basic unit of analysis. But if the Paris Climate Agreement is going to accomplish its goals, it has to affect corporate behavior, because corporations are, by and large, the largest polluters in the world when you put them all together, right? So affect an international treaty that ultimately trickles down or sideways or whichever way you want to think about it, to the corporations, this is really the ultimate test for whether the treaty is having impact. And so we wanted to go and look at that very difficult question. It turns out to be very tricky from a social science perspective. There's a real research design problem with this, but it's too important to ignore. And so the core question for us, let me get this thing to work. Oh, I can't. Maybe I'll give that to you and try with the arrows. Nope, it's not working out. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, excellent. So the core question is, to what extent did firms, corporations, shift resources towards decarbonization in the wake of the 2015 Paris Agreement? And we're focused on firms, not just states, because they're really important polluters. And the existing body of political science offers sort of diametrically opposed potential answers to this question. Could be yes, could be no, could be sort of anywhere in between. And this is a challenging question to answer because many of us have kind of prior beliefs about what the answer is before we come in. And so we know that from psychology, that's very hard for us to shift our own beliefs about it. But we wanted to try to take the process of deliberation very seriously and challenge our own set of beliefs on this. But also, many of us, if you care about climate change, have a view about what we'd like the answer to be. And that's even more difficult to challenge because, of course, I want the answer to be yes. I want the answer to be yes, Paris had a big impact on resources. And whether that's true or not, well, that's what I'm going to get to. But that's the challenge. And so we have two potential answers in some of the existing literature. One is yes, that Paris was going to be this kind of all hands on deck moment. In fact, the argument is that it was an all hands on deck moment, that it mobilized cities and NGOs and companies and states to come together to wrestle with this problem, and therefore was a treaty not just an agreement between states, but also ultimately involved all of the subnational actors within those. And potentially, it might have even signaled the start of a norm shift or a norm cascade, if you want to use Catherine Sickink's words on this, towards everybody sort of realizing, yep, this is the program now. We better get with it, and so we need to work on climate change. On the other hand, IR scholars, by nature and by scholarly tradition, tend to be very skeptical about treaties and about international agreements, that they are often viewed as kind of cheap talk. And so there's real skepticism about whether this is actually a credible movement. And beyond that, we know sort of from watching various corporations do their thing that greenwashing is a real potential, right? Greenwashing being like you say you're going to do something good for the environment, but not actually carrying it through, right? Not walking the walk. And so what's the answer? We wanted to know. We realized probably the answer is somewhere in between, but let's see what we can do to find out. And so the premise of our research design is that we're going to look at firms that we think are kind of most likely cases for behavioral change. Because if we looked at, say, big oil, did they change after the Paris Agreement? If we found that, lo and behold, big oil has not changed a whole lot, that would be sort of too hard a test. We wouldn't really expect that, and that would be maybe an unfair test of the Paris Agreement and whether it had impact. And likewise, solar and wind on the renewable side, like they were sort of already in motion on that. So it wouldn't necessarily be the right test. What we want to look at are companies in sectors where there was like a really viable strategy to shift from one business practice to another business practice, a cleaner, lower carbon business practice. And so we decided to focus on the global automobile manufacturing sector because there was kind of a clear alternative product, right? That electric vehicles was a technology that was not identical in cost, but it was sort of in the right ballpark, that there was a substitutable product, and that these firms were already starting to think about whether, what mix of products that they were going to generate in terms of internal combustion engines, the traditional cars versus EVs, and there's some hybrids in between. And one nice feature about focusing on this sector is that there are 12 global firms that collectively manufacture about 80% of the world's cars. And so that gives you sort of a reasonable number to go after in terms of understanding what's going on. And so we're going to focus on those 12 firms. All of these brands probably already. And the question is not a lot of political scientists, when they think about corporate behavior, they'll want to know, did the companies lower their emissions from their business practices? And that's kind of an interesting question, but for these firms, it's a less interesting question than what are they selling, because the downstream effect of their products is 75% of their overall emissions, right? It's the fossil fuels that are being burnt by these cars that really matter. And so switching to EVs is sort of the really interesting question with respect to getting to net zero of some kind. Okay, so we wanted to think about, well, if the Paris Agreement was having an impact on these 12 companies, what would it look like, right? And we thought of, there's actually a bunch of different ways this could happen. But we're going to look at sort of the three that we think are the sort of the most likely ways that Paris could have a reasonably direct impact. And the terms reasonably direct are kind of meaningful because we're going to have some indirect pathways, but what we wanted to do is not make it sort of infinite in the sense of like, oh, indirect impact could be so diffuse and so over such a long time scale that it becomes kind of impossible to test. It sort of weakens the whole idea of impact if you make it sort of infinite that you know it could work through any pathway. And so the three most plausible ways that we thought that the Paris Agreement may have impacted the car firms or vehicle firms. One is that the treaty might have directly affected the incentives of these firms, right? So that's you know, by sending or providing like material incentives, dollars and cents on this. That's one possibility, H1. Second possibility is that the treaty might have encouraged the signatories, the national governments, to change their policies, whether it's through laws or regulations or other behaviors that then affect the firms. And then the third possibility is that the treaty might have acted outside of governments altogether through NGOs, through new non-state actors that might have encouraged these firms to behave differently. And one prominent example of that would be the SBTI, right? The Science-Based Targets Initiative that was encouraging firms to have kind of really meaningful net zero targets as opposed to just like, oh yeah, we're going to do that and it not be connected to their behavior in any real way. Okay, so what we set out to do, I'm just going to jump kind of right into the empirics, if you will, without getting too laden with the theory. What we wanted to do was to look at 5 different indicators for each of the 12 firms. So this gets a little bit complicated, but it gives us a lot of evidence in terms of like, what do we expect to see in terms of changed discussions, like rhetoric, targets, investments, and ultimately product sales, right? Because what we want to see is that the companies are changing, well, ideally all of these things, but we know that they happen at on different timescales. A company can change the way it talks about what it's going to do, but quite quickly, right? It can do that tomorrow. But if they actually want to produce new products, new vehicles, that takes years to happen, right? They have to design new electric vehicles, they have to change their factories, and so there's a time lag. And so we're trying to use different streams of data to kind of triangulate on understanding whether they're really changing or not. And so one thing we did was look at the earnings calls. These are quarterly earnings calls where the CEO or other senior official from the company will talk to analysts and say, this is what we're doing. And the first thing we wanted to know is, well, how much are they talking about climate change over time? And what we found is that after 2015, I don't know how well you can see the bottom axis, but the big vertical line that you see there is 2015, right? So the Paris Agreement happens at 2015. And after that, you see one company, the one that's in a purple line there, talking about climate change an awful lot more. That's BMW. And so that one seems to signal like, look, we are much more interested in aligning our corporate behavior with the goals of Paris and climate change. Unfortunately, that is one of 12. And so most of the other companies, we do not see much of a step change in terms of how they talk about climate change. We see a little bit of upward trend, but it's certainly not very pronounced, and it's also not linked really with 2015 in particular. So that's...
What's the y-axis?
Yeah, so these are, that's a measure of how much of the transcript of the words that the officer uses are related to climate change. And so what we do is take the transcript and then look for bigrams that are related to climate change. Why the earnings calls? So suppose that I'm the CEO of BMW. I'm going to talk with earnings analysts for half an hour. How the y-axis is measuring how much of that half an hour am I talking about climate change? That's the sort of the, yeah. Thank you for the question. I'm glad to take it. Okay, so another way we can think about this is in corporate targets, right? How do they talk about, or what, not just talk, but what are the investment and production targets that they set post 2016 in terms of nationally specific, electric vehicle targets? Like how much are they going to change their product offering? And this is unfortunately really hard to summarize in a concise way, because to do this, we had to sort of go company by company and look at what they did. But I'm going to kind of bubble up as best I can and say that what we found is that 3 firms, we have like some fairly reasonable positive evidence of targets changing towards more EVs after Paris. That's consistent with what we would expect from Paris impact. That's BMW, Daimler, and Ford. With 5 other firms, we really don't have very good evidence. It's mixed or very weak evidence, and mixed is kind of usually a generous interpretation. And then we have 4 firms that just flat out don't change their targets at all over that. So again, we have some evidence of shifting, but it's not great. And so that would be these nationally specific targets would be consistent with that second mechanism where we expect Paris to affect the national government policies that then affects corporate behavior. The other mechanism was H3, which was around non-state actors. And there, unfortunately, we really don't see a lot of engagement with the non-state actors. The corporations mostly ignore these non-state actors. Again, BMW being the one that engages, and BMW and GM engaging most seriously with SBTI. But even there, it's sort of like it's hard to interpret how much it's actually affecting. Okay, so let's do something a little more quantitative there. So I'm going to give you some actual numbers. I realize that this is going to be hard to read, but the indication, the thing that you want to look at is just the shape of the line. So you don't need to know the numbers per se. What this is all 12 companies. And yes, you'll say, wait, hang on, there's 13 up there. There are 13 because there was a merger during this time between, oh God, now I'm forgetting. Is it, it's PSA and, so it's Peugeot and another one. I'm sorry? Yeah. Fiat, thank you. Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot come together. And so the kind of picture that we're expecting if Paris is having a big impact is something like the one that you see for GM, where around 2015, you'll see quite a sharp uptick in investment. This is not investment in EVs specifically because we couldn't obtain that data. This is investment overall in terms of what they're doing for the corporations, but it's consistent with the idea that if you're switching your product line, you would expect sort of an uptick in investment. And we see that with GM. So that's the most promising one. With Nissan, you see a relatively high level of investment quite consistently. That's probably not so surprising that Nissan was a very early mover on EVs. They had the Leaf, which kind of took over Norway's car market for a few years and is still quite prominent there. Most of the other car companies, in fact, I would say almost all of them, you don't see much shift in investment, or if you do see a shift, it's not consistent with what we would expect in terms of an uptick after Paris. So that's not very positive news. And then finally, we looked at firm sales of electric vehicles. And this is the trickiest one because what we're trying to understand is, okay, so you have an event in 2015, which is Paris. we don't expect that the change is going to happen instantaneously for an uptick in sales, but we do expect there to be, by 5 years out, some sort of indicative shift. And there is overall more electric vehicles. What's tricky to know is whether that trend is associated with the Paris Agreement. Because of course there are lots of other things going on, and the most important of which is that the technology is getting much better, and you have companies like Tesla who are starting to challenge these incumbents. And so what we do see is a couple of companies, again, BMW and Honda, and to a certain extent, if you squint at it hard enough, GM could be consistent with this. What you certainly don't see is the Japanese companies, Toyota, Honda, and Suzuki, largely stick with their existing patterns. And you'll see, oh no, but hang on, those bars are fairly high. But I should be clear about this. Most of the bars, the gray bars you see here, are hybrid vehicles. They're not plug-in hybrids. They're basically internal combustion engines that have an electric motor to make it more efficient, but the raw energy is still coming from either petroleum of some sort, either gasoline, diesel. So the shift that we want to see is really in those black bars, which are the vehicles that are electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids. Okay. So overall, I'm going to try to summarize all this together. And if you think about how we would expect the Paris Treaty or Paris Agreement, I shouldn't call it a treaty, to operate, it should operate, again, we've got those 3 mechanisms in the rows down here with direct incentives, national policy, or non-state actors. What we expect is that 2 things have to be true for any one of those mechanisms to be true. One is, in the next column over, we get necessary preconditions. Something has to have changed policy-wise or behavior-wise at a structural level for that mechanism to be operative. And then the next 3 columns are firm specific, right? So when we look at each one of those 12 firms, what would we have to see there? And we've got 3 different columns because we're measuring, on one hand, goals and strategic alignment, which has a lot to do with rhetoric ultimately, and then investments, and then actual production. And so just to go through this a little bit systematically, on the incentives mechanism, the first mechanisms, did Paris provide direct material incentives? The answer is basically this fails at the first step, the necessary precondition, because the treaty didn't really provide material incentives. It was supposed to. Article 6 was supposed to generate a carbon market, an international carbon market that could have provided these kind of direct incentive to affect corporations. But Article 6 from the 2015 agreement is still being negotiated starting today at the latest COP, right? Each COP meeting every year, they renegotiate, they're trying to get to details about how to implement this. The truth is it's probably never going to be implemented. And so it has failed. Okay, the national policy, that one's more complicated because you can make a case at least that some economy-wide jurisdictions did have a change after the Paris Agreement. And I changed my language a little bit there for not just to countries, but to economy-wide jurisdictions, because I'm going to treat the EU as a sort of single country or country analogy for those purposes, because the Euro 6 fuel standard regulations are done at an EU level. And although EU 6 had already been set in motion and was adopted by 2014, it was significantly strengthened after Paris. And the EU said very clearly, actually, we are strengthening this because we want to meet our Paris Agreement. And so that's, I think, the best case that you could say, yes, Paris seems to have had impact on national policy. In the US and in Japan, it gets much harder to make that argument. In the US, of course, if Trump comes into office, the changes that are happening are not at the national level, and in Japan, it's definitely not the case. China is a little bit harder to read. China does have some change during this period, but because it's autocratic, it's very difficult to parse out what exactly was driving those. Okay, so that one we just color yellow is kind of like a maybe plausible, but then we sort of see some questions about at the firm level how much this actually was. And then the last level, yes, Paris definitely did lead to some new non-state actors such as SBTI and others associated with the Lima platform. But the degree to which the companies actually engaged with those non-state actors are where we think that this mechanism sort of falls down, that it doesn't seem to have actually generated a whole lot of change, which is a little bit disappointing, to say the least. So, as I've said, this, I think, what I've tried to do here is just lay out, the evidence that we've gathered in the most dispassionate way possible. And then the way we interpret that, well, that's going to be a little bit, it's going to depend a little bit on the standards of evidence that we use. And so I'm going to just lay out how I think about this, because it is quite a challenging problem, right? From a causal inference perspective, what we need, right, to make a really good causal inference is, planet 2 where Paris never happened, and then we can see, what the impact was, right? But we don't have planet 2. We can't compare that. And so we have this very challenging counterfactual problem. We don't have the kind of scenario where we can, in a lab, you can treat a bunch of petri dishes and then not treat a bunch of others and then see what happens. That's not what's happening here. All 12 companies, they were all treated, right? They all got the Paris treatment. But the question is, well, how do we interpret what we've seen? And that's why we try to use this kind of intermediate standard of evidence, where instead of saying, well, one test would be like, if we immediately saw a change in corporate behavior, we could say, aha, Paris definitely had an impact. We don't see that, but that's not necessarily evidence that Paris didn't matter. And likewise, if we said, like, look, Paris might have a very long-term diffuse kind of impact, that's still true. It might still be having an impact right now, right? Almost 10 years after the agreement. But at a certain point, it's probably worth taking stock and saying, okay, do we actually see real change? And so that's why we take this kind of middle path of looking for a very identifiable pathway, and then look for change that seems possible within a time frame consistent with changing a large organization. Just to drive the comparison one step further, and this is a little tricky because the US Inflation Reduction Act is, of course, a domestic law. It's backed by lots of money, so it is not the same as the Paris Agreement. But what we want to show is that what we want to ask is, like, okay, when there is a policy that does have, some muscle behind it, do corporations respond to that kind of policy? And the answer is almost certainly yes, right? When there are real incentives being offered, what we see is a very dramatic uptick in at least the announcements for EV investment. Those announcements are not 100% credible, and so sometimes these get walked back. But I think the sort of the uptick in proposed investment is real, right? Maybe not all the way this real, but some measure of it is real. And so it seems much, much larger than when Paris comes along and has a much smaller impact, because it can't, or at least it didn't in this case, offer material incentives the way that domestic law did. Okay, so I'm walking you to a very gloomy conclusion, and so I'm going to first do the bad parts of the conclusion, then hopefully talk a little bit about what's left as positive in terms of climate action. What we find, unfortunately, is that, that the Paris Agreement likely caused some rhetorical change, but it does not seem to have caused a whole lot of behavioral change by corporations, at least not within this sector. What we're finding is that for only 2 out of the 12 items is there really plausible evidence of a shift, certainly with BMW, to some extent with Nissan, Renault Nissan. I realize I didn't highlight that very much in my discussion, but there is some evidence in theirs. There's 2 others, Honda and GM, that might be, we can't rule them out, but we don't have enough evidence we certainly don't have enough evidence to be confident that Paris shifted their behavior. And then the other ones, the evidence isn't definitive, but we really, you have to bend over backwards to try to create a story whereby these other companies shifted their behavior. So overall, we think this should lead us to revise downwards our confidence that Paris actually had any kind of real impact on the companies. So the implication for political scientists is that we have a lot of research about how these types of agreements come about. What were the diplomacy strategies? What were the various interests and mobilization that happened to make them possible? That is some really interesting research, but at the end of the day, if it's not having impact, right? If these agreements aren't driving change environmentally, then it sort of undermines all of the stuff that we the big effort we go to understanding how they came about. And so I think taking these kinds of questions seriously about effectiveness is something that we ought to do as political scientists, and we are too likely to dodge them because of the research design challenges. Okay. Although we have a kind of gloomy conclusion about the impact of the agreement itself, we think that the potential is that the biggest impact of these COP meetings, right, that it's one starting today, as Professor Hall mentioned, is not so much necessarily in the main event, if you will, the one that gets all the attention, where diplomats negotiate over a text, because the text doesn't seem to actually translate into behavior. What might be much more important is that you have all of these actors, NGO communities, companies, various stakeholders that are interested in climate change. They come to a global meeting, they talk to each other, they learn strategies from each other, then they go back to their domestic political context and try to work on the problem from there. And there's some at least suggestive evidence from my new colleague Jen Haddon, among many others, and I think I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think Professor Hall might include herself in that group, that this might be the most important way that these meetings, global meetings around climate change, actually transform the politics, not because of the script of paper that they sign, but because of the sort of engendering tactical shifts around the world. And I should point out that these tactical shifts, they go both ways. It's not just the NGOs that are learning, it's also the companies that might be a little reluctant to move on climate change. They're learning from each other as well, right? So that it definitely cuts both ways. The other caveat I would add about this whole thing is, of course, is that in this talk, I focused just on one manufacturing sector and one way that Paris could affect the world. It is certainly possible that Paris is affecting the world in other ways. It might be affecting it through the global financial system, or a whole bunch of other, through the global media environment, information context. So this is why, you have to see research in context of, like, this is a brick in a larger wall. But it's an important brick, because if we're not affecting the manufacturers of what we use every day, then we're doing something wrong. We're not getting all the way there. And so we want to understand how to do this better. And I think that leads us back to domestic politics and collective mobilization from a sort of bottom up and local mobilization mode, rather than putting all of our hopes into a UN process that is now 30 years old and is unfortunately not generating the kind of change at nearly the speed that we need. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd be delighted to question. How are you doing?
Perfect. That's great. I have lots of questions, but I am going to open up first the floor, and then if there aren't any, I'll jump in with mine. So does anyone want to kick off? Please also, if you're online, write in the Q&A box so then I can see them.
I'm going to sit just because my feet need a rest.
Walking all around Bologna today. Yeah, great. And maybe introduce yourself. We'll take a couple. Yeah, thanks, Tito.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tito Cordero. Let me just start. Very nice presentation, really enjoyed it. But let me start with a boring, a pedantic question from an economist. I understand all the caveat you had, but I sort of failed to understand your identification strategy. So why it is COPOM and not the soccer European Cup, the Champions League? So what does it, how could you identify that all we are talking about comes from COPOM and not from something else?
Yeah,
Can
so
I jump in just to see if there's any other questions? I should go for it. Yeah, Eleanor, again.
Can I exploit my microphone privileges?
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if in your research you also considered the role of the COP and as a platform for the Global South to raise their voice, and if so, how and if these dynamics will be reflected in developing economies and in the Global South. And especially now after the Summit of the Future, it seems the UN wanting to give power or rebalancing the dynamics with the Global South. Thank you.
Let's grab one more. Let's make it fun.
Hello. Yes. Okay. I'm Tom. My name is Tom. My question is related to the last point, the first one there, and then also on your hypothesis too, and then specifically with the IRA. So is there any way to tell, it might not be in this research, but is there a way to tell whether the sort of norm setting or the process that COP has done, as you say in point one there, impacted the strength of, for example, the IRA as a national way to address that? So like, is there an interrelationship there that counterfactual without Paris, the IRA would look different?
Right. 3 easy questions, no problem at all. Thank you so much for all of them. Let me try to take them in the order they were given. So the identification strategy, if you're looking for a sort of standard econometric identification strategy, you're going to be really disappointed. It's really hard. And I said why, because we're in a situation of kind of treating everything. And so what we've done is a combination of 2 strategies that are, I won't say always, I won't say often, but they're common in political science. One is kind of a process tracing for all 12 cases, and to try to look very carefully at the moments when there was significant corporate change, and are those plausibly linked back to Paris, and that's done in conjunction with kind of alternative explanations. So what trying to investigate what are the empirical implications of, say, alternative possibilities. So for instance, there are some real confounders that happen. VW has a Dieselgate scandal sort of right in the midst of this. And so evaluating why VW did the things that it did gets very tricky, and we do our best to try to parse through those. But it's tricky, and I wish I had a satisfying answer for you.
But also, I understand that it's not econometric, it's logically why it's called, if you try to placebo effect, another day. So for this, I understand all the difficulties, but I really don't understand how you identify the cost process effect. Not because it's just why this problem, not just
Yeah, so, right, so it could have been anything in 2015, and we don't have an answer for that. Our working assumption is that the most plausible alternative explanations, like technological change, don't happen all in 2015, that they are kind of a steady enough process. But yes, it's a real limitation, and I'd be first to own up to it. I guess this is connected to Tom, so maybe I'll do it in a different order. I'll come back to the global stuff. The question is, like, would Paris affect IRA? It's certainly possible that it did so. The sort of concise answer in this paper is that we just say, we don't know, we're not testing that. It's too far, it's sort of out of scope in terms of the sort of middle way that we're doing, because of course IRA doesn't happen until 7 years after Paris. If you push me a little bit harder, or maybe actually it goes the other way, if you're a little bit softer about sort of allowing me to conjecture, it's certainly, on one hand, you can tell a story about how Paris might have sort of set the conditions under which IRA became kind of politically more possible. On the other hand, you could flip the counterfactual and say, okay, if there's an epic failure at Paris, as there was in Copenhagen, there might have been even more political pressure for national governments to act. And that would have actually maybe made the IRA just as plausible, maybe more plausible, especially if you're willing to acknowledge that scientists at the IPCC and elsewhere are going to continue to come out with reports, say, on like the impact of 1.5 rather than 2 degrees Celsius, and how really significant even a 1.5 change will be, is already. You're at 1.5. And so I think I think I become quite skeptical at that point that IRA is necessarily linked. I mean, it's possible, but I just don't know that we can really make that kind of argument, that it's that it could have contributed, but it becomes too loose a conjecture for my comfort level. On the global south, here I think that what you see with the global south happening and demanding kind of more attention to the issues that they care about, which was, from a moral perspective, certainly very understandable, of course, that they are going to suffer the consequences of climate change in disproportionate ways, disproportionate to all kinds of things, to their historic contribution to the problem, disproportionate to their ability to handle and to mitigate or to adapt to the circumstances they find themselves in. So you can very much understand why the global south are now asking for a lot. But as an IR person, I have kind of a hard-nosed perspective on how much the global south is likely to be able to drive change, in that what we see over and over and over again is that IR is a realm where the strong do what they do and the weak have to adapt to that. And on the margins, yes, things like foreign aid exist. Yes, things like, there are occasionally instances of powerful states constraining themselves and offering kind of goodies to weaker nations. But those tend to be really at the margins, right? So total foreign aid is some tiny fraction of global GDP. And I think it's likely to stay that way. And so when I think about climate solutions, I don't put a lot of eggs in that basket because it's just not a strong enough lever. I think when you compare that to the need for technological change and the possibility of technological change, there you have a much stronger lever. And so the way that the global south, I think, can demand change at a better rate is to say we want technological transfer at a cost-effective rate, right, or a subsidized rate, or what have you, and that's the kind of thing that can work and that can actually drive really significant changes in the global south when suddenly new technology becomes available, and it's available to everybody in ways that patents can't prevent a certain spread of it.
Great. I can see some more hands up. I also have a question. So yeah, let's go.
Yeah, my name is Annabelle, and I have a question about rhetoric. Because not necessarily only about COP, but because you looked at the earnings calls and the corporate targets.
Yeah.
Whenever we have these discussions, I feel that we still focus so much on, like, we portray climate change as a negative externality, and companies need to be subsidized and incentivized in order to do something about it. And I'm always wondering, is there not a case to make for that? I mean, is there, why do we even need these incentives? Is there not a very clear case for companies to invest in clean technology now to stay competitive in the future, especially if you look at I mean, I heard that the floods in Slovenia created costs that added up to 16% of their GDP, which when I hear this, I think I don't even understand how we're still why we still need to convince people. So when you looked at these earnings calls, for example, would you say that this is something that corporations are starting to see this way, and especially also taking into consideration that the EU is about to launch their Clean Industrial Act, and they are trying to combine climate policies with competitiveness? And do you think that is reasonable, or do you think it's a PR thing? I don't know.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hartmut, did you have a question?
Yeah, one question.
Mhm.
With the case that legal agreement, global ones, change in a sort of norm cascade change, and it is the anticipation of the consumer that we should look into as part of the explanation, in addition to social movements and so on. The other one is much more specific and much more cynical. Whether car companies make decisions for different markets. And one of the things in the EU is that it's not overall emissions that count, but fleet emissions.
Yeah.
Which means in order to make money with high polluting combustion engines, you need to have electric vehicles as part of your fleet, because the average emission counts rather than the individual one. So it's part of the explanation that there is a business case to invest, even if you lose money on an electric vehicles, in order to continue to make profits from high polluting combustion engines, which you need if you're BMW and Daimler and so on, and you need less if you are in a different market. So one is the impact on consumers, and the other one is a much more cynical business strategy as part of an explanation of what happened.
I'm going to add a third question using my chair's prerogative, and then we'll come back for the next round afterwards. So one of the things I wondered was, you only looked at traditional car companies. As far as I can tell, Tesla wasn't part of it.
Yeah.
So is there an argument, and I'm not saying it would be a positive result, that you need to look at overall electric vehicle cars globally rather than just looking at the traditional car companies? Because we all know the German car industry has been slow to change, right?
Mhm.
So did you consider, or what do you think you would find if you looked, rather than just at traditional 12 car companies, the total sales of electric vehicles versus the proportion or total sales of combustion engines? And or, this is a little bit more provocative, is there any argument, and I would be surprised if this was the case, of people actually dropping their sales or purchases rather of all cars and opting for either public transport or bikes? Because that would be the real effect, right? That's what you really want to see. And so I'm not expecting you to have an answer for that, but it's just a provocative, like, could we, and have we, or have you thought about it? So that's kind of going along the line that Hartmut, and then we'll come back to the next questions.
Well, that's great. That's so, well, all of these are really good questions, but I can't resist dealing with this one first, because it's a really important question. You know, absolutely, it'd be wonderful to see sort of what we'd love to see on some sort of variance over time on total car sales, is that, you know, you have some upward trajectory or steady car consumption, and then 2015 happens and you get like a sharp continuity, right? The trend changes. We don't see that. We just don't see it. It's not in the data. It's sort of relatively steady growth, 1 or 2% globally overall, and so we, unfortunately, and yes, it would be lovely to see. I think, frankly, it would be quite counterintuitive to believe that. I mean, if you're living in a city like Copenhagen, maybe you could make that case that this sort of change happened. I think actually the story with Copenhagen is that bicycles started long before 2015, but around the world, the thirst for automobiles is still growing, and in particular, India is maybe the next great car market, and so that growth continues. And there's some companies, and this actually comes back to the question around kind of car companies doing specific markets. Suzuki arguably has made a bet that they're going to go hard into India, and they're going to just stick with the internal combustion engine and to heck with the rest of the world. And so there's a flavor of what that this happens to a certain degree. But what about Tesla? So yes, Tesla existed as important. Tesla was, in a sense, already doing its thing well before Paris. And I don't think that you could make a very strong case that Paris altered fundamentally the trajectory that Tesla was on, because it was already doing what it was doing well before 2015 and continued to do it afterwards. It obviously benefited massively from whenever it could take advantage of selling credits to incumbent companies that needed to meet regulatory requirements, and that's how they make a lot of their profits, right? So yes, this is happening, and the demonstration effect of Tesla, I don't want to downplay at all. I think it's enormously important for you to have a car company that can just prove that, yes, this can be done. We can sell electric vehicles. People do want to buy them. And our take on this is that, yes, while there are some challengers out there, they are not they're not supplying enough electric vehicles to saturate the market. What you see, and you can see this in consumer surveys, et cetera, in 2015, 2016, 2017, is that there are long waiting lists of customers that want to buy electric vehicles and can't find one because Tesla can't produce them fast enough and other companies aren't doing it. And so it's not to say that there is an infinite demand. Of course, there's going to be different types of consumers, and some consumers have no interest in electric vehicles at all, especially in 2016, 2017. This is not widespread, but there is still a substantial portion of the market that is interested in an electric vehicle, and that demand is to a certain extent being unmet. So our view is that the real sort of question here is like, are the companies responding to that demand or not? So that's why we study those. Okay. On consumer choice, and this speaks to that as well, I guess, is that it is the case that consumers can affect corporate behavior, of course. It does matter on a national level whether you have things like a charging network for electric vehicles. And so countries that have actually invested in those charging networks, like Norway, are going to have, you're going to see a much bigger uptake in EVs. But what we were trying to capture with that third mechanism was the idea that Paris might have affected, particular non-state actors that could be consumer groups that affect the firms. What we don't find is like a real evidence that there was like a consumer focused group that did that kind of action that led to it. And so could it affected norms in general? Yes, but this comes back to the sort of the IRA question, is that it's sort of too diffuse for us to be able to measure. It just becomes a research design problem. Okay, and then I realize my answers are getting very lengthy, so I'm going to try to shorten them. But Annabelle, your question about why do we have to provide incentives at all? It's a very understandable question, but it's a really tough one, because while on the on the country level and the global level, certainly, I think there is a very clear case that we would be better off and there are clear net benefits by taking climate mitigation actions. So that it is costly to decarbonize our economy, but the benefits of decarbonizing are huge. The trouble is that the benefits accrue A, to everyone, and B, to future generations. And that's inconsistent with who has to pay those costs to do the switch. And unfortunately, many of the actors that would have to pay the cost, like a big corporation, whether it's a car manufacturer or even more so for, say, ExxonMobil, they're not interested in providing benefits. It's not in their business model to provide benefits to future generations or to poor people in Africa. They're interested in providing, profits to their shareholders. And they're not wrong that they can make bigger financial returns by pumping oil than they can doing just about anything else, which is deeply frustrating, but it is a reality. And so getting kind of incentive compatible policies to get people to move is, I think, part of, one of the central challenges of climate politics. And you're really putting your finger on that.
Sure, you can ask follow-up. No,
Yeah, what about competition with China? And there is, I'm German, and when within Germany, we already have this debate that if we don't manage to make this transition now, then the German car industry will cease to exist in the next 30 years. I don't know. Because people are going to buy electric vehicles eventually, and if the car makers in Germany are not able to provide them, people are going to buy Chinese ones. If it's not,
I agree.
why is that not?
Yeah, having that sort of far-sighted vision for change is something that, the Western version of capitalism doesn't do well. And there are some family firms that do it pretty well, right? So you can think of particular, firms that are caring about their future shareholders because they're their children, but, and then there's a family tie, but the typical, certainly in the United States, but even in many German firms, they're worried about their bottom line for next quarter. They're not thinking about their bottom line 30 years from now. And so to a certain extent, they say, the corporations would say, that's not our job. It's government's job to think 30 years down the line. Our job is to think about next quarter. And whether you buy that or not is a sort of separate question, but that's part of why we get that breakdown. But I think car companies are increasingly alarmed by the reality that China is coming for them. And you see this in policy. Many German car companies specifically, I think, are caught in a vice that they don't want the Chinese competition in Europe, but they can't say so out loud. In fact, they have to say the opposite out loud because they're also trying to sell cars in China. And the Chinese government does not want to hear the CEO of VW saying, yeah, we should put tariffs on China. So you can imagine the real dilemma that they're facing from a PR perspective.
and a very pertinent issue now. VW cutting workers. Let's take one last round of questions. Try and be short and sharp. And I've got an ad one as well. So yeah, go for it.
Hello, my name is Franziska, and I was wondering, this is maybe going a little off topic, but if the Paris Agreement cannot really contribute to firms changing their behavior, I was wondering if you see any potential in supply chain legislation that specifically targets firms to contribute to behavioral change, but considering that it's been very difficult for example, the EU legislation to include environmental aspects. So yeah.
Thanks, Francisco. Jaden and Martina here.
My question is, excuse me, concerns your research design and specifically the choice of car manufacturers. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share at all, like any insight of any other possible firms or areas that you guys were looking at. I mean, I know you mentioned that you're looking at like global financial markets right now, but as sort of a subcomponent of that question, I was also curious to hear a little bit more about the choice to go with like a firm that is able to transition? And I think, because I think to Professor Hall's point, there's an interesting question about like, is there a possible substitution effect to look at where there's just new firms that are generated by this sort of agreement? Or is that simply one, either too hard to measure, or two, dependent on technology ultimately? Like that's just sort of a moot question. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. My question is actually very similar to yours. So I was wondering whether you encountered in doing your literature review and your research, also other empirical studies looking into the public sector, the private sector, and the impacts of Paris Agreement to their behavior. Because you said yourself, this is only a small piece of the private companies, right? And the others might act differently.
And I'm going to add a final question, which is like the bigger zoom out of exactly what you're asking. And that's to say, the bleak image you gave us was the Paris Agreement is not changing firms' behavior. It's not changing the automobile industry. They're just continuing as normal. And that may be the case. I buy the argument. I don't find it like problematic per se. But I wonder if part of it is in how you're conceptualizing Paris, right? So the Paris Agreement, for those of you who are not familiar, sets targets that states should meet, right? And it's not clear on how they have to meet their actual targets. It's what's called a top-down, bottom-up. So you have to we all have to collectively try and get to 1.5 or maximum 2 degrees. You choose how you cut your own emissions. And what we know is that states are choosing to invest in emissions trading, offsetting, trying to externalize the emissions to other countries, things like CBAM, as well as investing in science and technology. So you can use hydrogen, alternative sources. So is there a bigger story here that, yeah, the traditional industries aren't changing, but actually that's just because states are opting for easier strategies of, offsetting or offshoring their emissions. So there is some effect of Paris, but it's not on the manufacturing industries.
Good. Okay. Very quickly, research design. One that we thought about doing was mining, the mining sector, for the same reason, in that there was like a potentially convertible. There was another product that they could focus on. So instead of mining coal, they could be mining lithium and copper and all the things that we need for batteries, et cetera. And we would have loved to do that. It was just like too much. It was a whole other project, and so we just stopped. But that was another possibility. We did want to focus again on that. That sort of sweet spot of an industry that is creating emissions now, but could convert to something that wasn't. And I think that's actually, that's trying to be generous to Paris in the sense that that's the most likely case that firms would, where it would be most likely to have impact. It's not going to be any use to anyone to find that big oil doesn't change its behavior because it's too hard. I mean, we know it's too profitable to keep doing that. On the literature review question, we didn't see a lot of other examples on this, although there was one other study around car manufacturing. I can give you the reference later. She's a little more optimistic than we are, but the standard of evidence is completely different. It was more about just looking at what the firms were saying. And we wanted to make sure that we looked at what they were actually doing in terms of some sort of quantitative measures of that. Okay. Supply chain legislation, I do have some positive hopes for. And I do think, every little bit helps in the sense of requiring accounting and disclosure and reporting. None of it on its own is going to change the world, but every little bit of it, brings more and more attention and more kind of capacity for how do companies change, right? And so when, let's say in an industry, you have 10 firms doing things and you find a couple of firms, if they're required to report and required to track these sorts of things, you find a couple of firms that are, relatively green and a few firms that are relatively brown, then hopefully over time that moves the best practices, it moves the average up over time. Is that a silver bullet? No. But is that helpful? Yes. And so, every bit helps. Nina's great question on about sort of choose your own adventure for how do we get to net zero. Yes, and one can tell a story where, you know, it could be just too early to tell whether Paris Agreement has had its impact. And so, yes, it's possible that we could be continuing on a rather dangerous path, but in 2049, we're suddenly going to, you know, have all of our bets pay off, where we invented new technologies and we got hydrogen and we got carbon storage, and then suddenly our emissions just drop to the floor. That's possible. I don't want to bet on that scenario. I don't think that that's credible. And I think the more realistic thing is to say, let's take stock after 10 years and see how we're doing. And if we're seeing real red flags, then we need to work harder to get back on target. And so while logically I buy buy what you're saying completely, I just think politically that's a dangerous move.
Wonderful. And I should say I was being a bit of a devil's advocate. I'm also not a fan of the pure let's just, you know, put it all under the ocean and we'll carbon capture storage will solve our problems. So thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. I want to say thank you on two accounts. One, for all the IR theory people in this room. I think in your slides, you mentioned a lot of the theories we discuss in our class. I could see some eyes light up because there was norm cascades with Catherine Sickink, which we're about to do in the coming week. You mentioned Faulkner, who we will read in the Climate Week, Thomas Hale's work on IOs. You also, even in one of your responses, talked about how the strong do what they want and the weak will follow. We had a little bit of Thucydides coming in. So we got a full mix of our IR theories, which was awesome. But more importantly, beyond IR theories, what we care about also is, of course, how do we solve climate change, which is, I think, a really important issue. And I think trying to tackle it from a perspective that's political economy, engaging with economics, but also political science and IR is great from multidisciplinary. And because it affects us here, right? We've just seen the Valencia floods. And I think the image of the cars piled up is probably the most powerful image from those floods. And, you know, there are people in the SAIS community who've lost their homes over the floods here in Bologna. So I think these are issues which, while they're intellectually stimulating, they actually have a real impact on people's lives. And we do, I think, need to remember that and think about the politics of then how do we get change. And I think this kind of work is super important. So a big round of applause. Thanks so much, Jeff, for sharing your work.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to all of you for your questions. The one on supply chains, I just want to make a quick call out. On Friday, the 22nd of November, I believe that's next Friday, I'm hosting a full day workshop on climate litigation. We're bringing in some of the leading scholars who think about how do we get action through the courts on climate change, both at domestic and international level. And we're having some speakers talk to the question of, can you hold supply chains to account? Because generally when we think of litigation against governments and businesses, but what about entire supply chains? So that's actually one of the questions in the program. As you know, students both of Unibo and SAIS, you're all welcome to attend. There will be an email going around to register. We will have students who are moderating and discussing. So it's not just experts, there's also going to be Unibo and SAIS students there interacting with the panelists, moderating them, discussing them. And I think it's a really exciting workshop because climate litigation is not the only way we're going to see change, but it's one way we're seeing states held accountable. And there are some big cases coming up, including the ICJ case where some students from Vanuatu basically went to the International Court of Justice to clarify states' obligations under the Paris Agreement. So please spread the word, tell other friends and classes. It's a really unique opportunity to be talking with so many great legal and political science scholars next week. Thanks again and have a good evening.